Okay, good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's been able to join us today for a stakeholder consultation, Social Protection. This is a tool for climate change adaptation. Start by introducing myself. My name is Tom Spangler, and I'm Project Director for the Real 2 Associate Award. Now, as you likely know, this has been organized through Real 2, which is a consortium-led effort funded by the USA Center for Resilience and implemented by Save the Children, Mercor, and Tango International. Preceding Real Award was assessed to respond to the growing demand among a wide range of key stakeholders for rigorous yet practical support for resilience evaluation, monitoring, and learning. And under Real 2, we're expanding on this work by addressing technical areas within the resilience instrument framework. In the initial stages of Real 2, our parts with Center for Resilience identified social protection as a specific technical area of interest that relates to resilience. So again, today's consultation will focus on social protection as a tool for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And we expect this to be the first of multiple consultations hosted by Real 2 to examine other connections between social protection and resilience. For today's consultation, we have two major objectives. The first is to identify common challenges and lessons learned for implementing social protection in a manner that supports climate adaptation and mitigation. Our second objective is to identify specific barriers and knowledge gaps in this area that can inform iteration of Real 2 activities and those of others related to protection and climate change adaptation. Your expert input today is going to be really helpful for prioritizing specific gaps in the area of social protection and climate change that we can follow up on and hopefully address some of these knowledge gaps. We'll start with a brief welcome and presentation of USAID's initial analysis area, as well as a conceptual overview from Lara Evans, Social Protection Advisor for the USAID Center for Resilience. We're then going to dive a bit deeper into the conceptual and practical linkages between social protection and climate change, and a presentation from Marie-Christina Donkmeyer, who's the Social Protection and Climate Change Specialist at the International Labour Organization. So with that, I'll pass it over to Lara.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. First and foremost, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. On behalf of the Center for Resilience at USAID, I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have such an incredibly diverse and robust group of participants with us here, and we are looking forward to a rich dialogue on the interface between social protection and climate change adaptation and mitigation. As Tom mentioned, this is the first in a three-part consultation series. We have social protection and climate change, adaptation and mitigation today, and then we will be following up with two sessions on social protection and inclusion, looking at gender inclusion, financial inclusion, including informal workers, broad subsection of inclusion. And we will also be looking at social protection and conflict and fragility. This consultation series follows on work that was done last year, collecting primary and secondary data to inform a set of recommendations of how USAID could bolster its engagement in social protection. I know that I spoke with many of you during those consultations, so I want to thank you again for the generosity of your time and energy. Our intention today is to really dig into the operational challenges on the ground, connecting climate change adaptation, mitigation, and social protection. As you all know, the COVID-19 crisis has brought to the forefront the importance of protecting people in times of shock through large, established risk management tools, such as national social protection systems, as well as prearranged disaster risk financing. The magnitude of social protection responses to the COVID-19 crises is of historic proportions and has truly demonstrated the potential for these systems to respond to large covariant shocks. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir. The need for robust social protection systems and pre-planned financing for disasters is more urgent than ever in the face of increasing frequency and intensity of climatic events, leading to billions of dollars in humanitarian assistance, as well as diminished economic growth, major national budget dislocations, and eroded development gains. The dual nature of social protection's ability to sustain people during times of crises, as well as provide the means for all people to achieve basic human dignity, makes social protection a valuable tool to promote inclusive development, economic growth, improved health outcomes, and gender equality. It also makes it a key tool for managing climate risks by addressing chronic poverty, building human and social capital, and increasing financial resilience. In the resource packet that you received from Emily, you'll note that there are numerous documents that suggest a critical need for designing comprehensive climate responsive social protection strategies, for mainstreaming climate concerns into national social protection frameworks, for integrating social protection into broader climate and development plans, such as comprehensive risk management strategies. These are exactly the type of topics that we are here to discuss today, and we're thrilled that you are here to join us. To kick us off, I just wanted to share two system graphics that describe social protection objectives and instruments. I'm sure many of you have seen them, developed them, shared them. And what I would like for us to note is that there's no specific reference to climate adaptation or climate mitigation. And so today, throughout our discussions, I would like for us to explore what climate linkages can be added. So for example, in this slide, most of us, when we think about the interface between climate adaptation and social protection, we think about social assistance, and we think about climate smart agriculture, climate sensitive public works on a massive scale. For example, the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia. Under social insurance, we talk about unemployment insurance, pensions, maternity leave, workers' benefits, but could we be talking about crop insurance, livestock insurance, informal worker schemes linked to climate safe, climate neutral jobs? And then under labor market programs, could we specifically focus on training, retraining, or upskilling people to take on climate safe, climate neutral, or maybe even green jobs, as the new terminology goes? The next slide is the same version of the first slide. It just breaks down in a little bit more detail what some of the activities are under social protection components and instruments. And again, this is really just to point out that we in the social protection community are not really talking about instruments to achieve climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So that is what I'm opening up with this morning. And I would like to pass over to Marie-Christina Dankmeyer, Social Protection and Climate Change Specialist at ILO, for a deeper dive into the conceptual and practical linkages between social protection and climate change. And I would like to say this is the only time that you're going to be presented to. From here on out, it is all about discussion. So thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to be here with you. Over to you, Marie-Christina.
Thanks so much, Lara, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And I'll try to keep it under 15 minutes, not to keep you for too long. I will try to complement a little bit the picture that Lara just painted regarding the different entry points for social protection to address climate change. And just on the overview slide, to also talk a bit about, first of all, which impacts we're even looking at, then going into the conceptual linkages. And Lara had already talked a little bit about the different entry points for social protection to address climate change. So I'll complement those, and then we'll look at practice examples as well at the end. And maybe I really just picked a few, but maybe we can go into different examples in the breakout sessions later on as well. So first of all, going to the first slide, the different impacts of climate change. Obviously, this list is not comprehensive, but what we see is climate change induced shocks and slow onset events as well exacerbate the different risks that people face over the course of their lives anyway. But we not only see these idiosyncratic, so individual risks, but we also see additional covariate risks that affect many different people at the same time. And so that kind of really increases poverty and vulnerabilities at a different scale and makes social protection so relevant in this regard. And so here are just a few of the pathways. So looking at health, we see increased mortality and morbidity. We see premature death and injuries, also in the case of extreme weather events, higher temperatures and increased respiratory and cardiovascular diseases as well, mental health, and also where different types of infectious diseases are actually prevalent. So food, water, and also vector-borne diseases. And overall, then it poses an issue in terms of food security and nutrition, malnutrition as well. We see decreases in food availability with lower agricultural yields and just lost biodiversity, issues with fisheries, ecosystems, and so on. There's an IPCC report that kind of details that very well. And then obviously lower income gains, and especially from agriculture, fisheries, forestries, tourism, so kind of the natural resource dependent sectors. And then also obviously lower labor productivity in some cases. But I think what we also see and often forget is that we see issues also, so economic impacts in other sectors. So when we look at construction, garments, waste, those kinds of things that are often not directly considered as climate related. And so there's quite a bit of job loss. So just if we look at ecosystem services and the jobs that are linked to that, those are 1.2 billion already. And so there are also quite a few jobs that are basically just being phased out on purpose. Jobs are being substituted, redefined, and obviously there are also newly created jobs. And just I think last year, renewable energy employment reached 12 million worldwide. And I think we see that curve going up as well. So quite a bit of potential for new job creation as well. And overall, just something else to consider is that when we see less available resources, there's quite a bit of potential, obviously, for conflict, migration, and also kind of negative effects on social cohesion overall. And so what we see, not everybody will be equally affected. I think that's important to consider in terms of age differences, gender, disability, people's means, but also where they're actually located geographically. So within countries, we see differences, urban, rural, but then also when we look at globally different regions, much stronger in Africa and Asia, where more people are in poverty and so at risk. They have higher exposure, but also lower capacity to actually adapt and deal with this. And in some cases, also less access to new technologies and so on. So just to name a few. So when we look at the different impacts, we see climate change impacts directly, but we also see potential negative impacts from the actual adaptation and also overall transition policies, so green policies overall. That we also have to address, and social protection can play a role here too. So first of all, just to say, before we go into this, social protection in itself can already address, help address climate change in its kind of core functions. And we'll look at these functions in a moment. But beyond that, we can actually, if we design it properly, contribute directly to climate change adaptation. So not just current impacts, but also what we will see in the future in terms of both sudden onset, so for example, disasters, and also slower onset, so in terms of sea level rise, temperature, etc. And we can also design it in a way that we can contribute directly to mitigation of climate change. So not just incentivizing people to avoid or reduce carbon or emissions, but actually also playing a role in supporting sequestration. So kind of biomass, so soil and trees to capture and store carbon. And one term that Emily also asked me to introduce is just transition, which is often a bit of a cryptic way to say green kind of policies that also ensure at the same time that we mitigate the economic and social kind of disruptiveness of carbonization. So making sure that transition won't actually leave anyone behind, and we ensure that people can actually actively participate in that transition, given the new requirements of the labor market, world of work overall as well. And I see a comment in the chat, but I can't really read it, so we'll get to that after. Sorry, Jamela, I think it is. So conceptually, going to the next slide, I won't go into this in detail because most of you may have seen this, but we can essentially break down the different functions for managing climate change or addressing climate change through social protection. We can look at social protection functions, so protecting people, for example, also against impacts of climate change, preparing for or preventing future impacts, looking at promotive or transformative aspects as well. This is, I think, quite nicely broken down by Daniele Malherbe in a publication in the Social Protection Handbook. So you can look it up. So we have the functions, we have the role in, for example, climate change adaptation, so absorptive capacity of people to absorb shocks, anticipating future impact, and then also being able to adapt. We can break it down by programs, and Lara already gave a few examples of programmatic approaches, and we'll look at that in more detail after. And we can also just look at it by instrument, so social assistance, social insurance, and active labor market policies and interventions. And this is quite useful sometimes because the magic often happens when we combine different functions and different instruments. So for example, linking social assistance and social insurance, or looking at income support and skills development together. And so I think that is sometimes quite useful to step back and look at it that way. So for the next slide on the different objectives and respective approaches. So we at the ILO have kind of broken down the whole topic this way. So we look at specific objectives in terms of climate change adaptation, climate change mitigation, and then also just broader social protection objectives in terms of reaching universality of coverage, of adequacy and different risks covered. And I just thought I'd use this kind of classification to give you a few examples and build on what examples Lara put forward earlier. So we have under climate change adaptation, essentially the protection from current and future impacts. So there we can look at linking social assistance and DRM, and Lara said it, but also looking, for example, at the role that social insurance can play to ensure that people are covered in the case of. So we'll look at the example of Mozambique a little bit later on how that can work. The example of, for example, for slow onset, linking social assistance to training for sustainable livelihoods is quite an interesting one as well. And then when we look at climate change mitigation, and this is often where objectives actually mix. So we look at rehabilitation, restoration, conservation, so for example, sustainable natural resource management, we can actually find or combine objectives of climate change adaptation and mitigation within the same program. So if we look at public works approaches, for example, and managing land and water resources can tackle some of the root causes of poverty and vulnerability, but can also kind of help capture and store carbon. And I mean, the basic examples that we see again and again, and I won't go into those because you may know them, are India, Ethiopia, the big PSNP program, or Kenya as well. But also other examples may include, for example, Cash Plus. The second point on climate change mitigation, we can also look at actively supporting the transition by incentivizing lower emissions. We can look at subsidies, waivers, looking at cash transfers as well to incentivize certain behavior. And we can actively support the move to green and also formal jobs. So making sure that newly created jobs are actually decent, so come with social protection benefits. And we can also link, for example, unemployment protection and active labor market policies or interventions. So skills development, job placement, social services, etc. And maybe one more word on overall social protection systems and policies. So we need to look at social protection policies on the one hand, and this is something that ILO also supports countries in developing those policies and social protection assessments, making sure that different climate change considerations are included in those. But we also need to look at green policies on the other hand. So actually looking at nationally determined contributions. Do they actually consider social protection as a tool? Looking at national adaptation plans, looking at national just transition plans, because these can also kind of position the tool of social protection to actually achieve these objectives. And finally, I won't say too much about systems building because all of you will know, but we'll look at social protection policies, look at more climate sensitive design that may not necessarily go into too much detail on adaptation and mitigation objectives, but still you can design social protection systems in a way that they actually maintain the functionality throughout different kinds of shocks without necessarily including these other objectives more explicitly. And we can also look at the delivery mechanisms level. So actually trying different kind of modalities of social protection programs that can actually consider climate related factors. So going into the next slide, sorry, the examples. So quite a few countries realize that social protection benefits are critical to support, so to prevent and protect from poverty and vulnerabilities in the face of climate change. But when we look at examples, there are different levels of interaction. So the first one being, we simply consider that there are climate change impacts. That would be the basic level. We then actually, as a second level, apply social protection as a tool in a more climate sensitive way. And this may also include, for example, compensation in the face of adverse impacts of green measures. And then yet another level would be actually sector design, so looking at green and social objectives together. And then finally, actually looking at transformative effects. So how can we get kind of outcomes of social protection and green approaches that we otherwise wouldn't have gotten just cumulatively across the different sectors. And so for the examples, I wanted to give you two that are more on the adaptation side, because I think initially this was conceptualized with more of an adaptation focus. So for slow onset and for sudden onset, starting with Mozambique, which you can see on the right side here, the big picture. It's an interesting example of how existing social assistance and social insurance mechanism can be used, and adaptive elements are defined ex ante before a shock actually happens. So the background is we had the 2019 cyclones, Ida and Kenneth, and following those lessons, we recently saw the adaptation, or the application of different mechanisms introduced then, so increasing benefit amounts, and then also expanding to more people in particular vulnerable geographic areas, an increase in 990,000 people in the context of COVID-19. So additional people were enrolled in a new direct social support program, and it was essentially three groups. So some were pre-identified based on needs, but then some were also actually identified that were previously registered in the INSS, so the Social Security voluntary scheme, but they stopped paying their benefits due to the impact of the pandemic and on their income. And so that was actually then taken into account to determine their need to receive social assistance. And I think that's a good example of how we can actually link basically just at the delivery mechanism level, different types of support options for people, and especially in this case, informal workers as a particular target group. And then there are also additional people who were identified with community-based organizations. And one of the lessons was that social partners and civil society organizations were involved quite systematically at an early stage in the communication, monitoring, complaints, referral management, and so on. So that was definitely a good lesson learned. A legal and a strategic framework was already in existence, so that's also quite important in this context. There was an adaptive mechanism for a covariate risk that was included that can now be used again and again. And the crisis response included or built on a collaborative platform between development partners and the government for coordination that was already there. And so I think those are some of the key points coming out of this example. Tom, I see you came back on. I'll just need 1 more minute for the second example, and I won't go into too much detail there. So for slow onset, we have a lot of, especially public works programs in this area that kind of introduce some climate change adaptation or also mitigation objectives. But I actually picked one in South Africa that I thought was also interesting because it's applied in an urban context as well, the South Africa Expanded Public Works Program. And that actually delivers public infrastructure, public environment management. So looking at water, parks, fire, wetlands, waste, so different kinds of pathways, and also helps diversify people's livelihoods and skills. So kind of an additional component there. So in terms of tourism, arts and crafts, community safety or community care. And I think this is an approach that can be quite useful to link adaptation and also to some extent mitigation measures in increasingly urban settings. So when we also look at rural out-migration as a broader trend, and also addresses some of the rather slow onset impacts that we see. And just one more word, I mean, we see that this program has been quite effective over longer than a decade at this point, but we still have high poverty and unemployment in the country, so that we can kind of see that this rather short to medium term measure would need to be complemented by longer term complementary policies, reforms to improve skills, providing more labor market opportunities and social redistributive policies. And I think this will be quite an interesting development now with the just transition process in South Africa underway, because I'm not sure if you heard, but rather recently around COP, about 8.5 billion US dollars were committed by different donors and countries to actually support South Africa's transition in the coal phase out. And so I think that provides quite an interesting opportunity to also look at climate change mitigation developments and the role of social protection in that. Back over to you, Tom, and more in the breakout rooms.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Christina and Lara, for both of your presentations. I know it's a lot of background to provide in a short amount of time, and probably very familiar to most of you in this group, but really helpful, I think, for setting up what we're moving to now, which will be a more interactive discussion on some of these topics. So each of you will now be placed into a breakout room. And each of the 3 rooms, breakout rooms, is going to discuss the same set of questions. Now, a window is going to appear shortly asking you to join a specific breakout room. And when it does, just click Join Room. Each room will have a facilitator and a note taker to lead the discussion and capture key points. And the note taker is going to share their screen so that everyone can see the notes being taken, but without requiring you yourself to go into the Miro board for right now. Notes will be taken for each conversation thread, and ultimately breakout group will share their perspectives on a central question. What are the key gaps in our knowledge about linkages between social protection, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation? Now, your ideas are going to be moved by note takers into Post-it notes before we bring you all back into the main Zoom room, where we'll spend some time prioritizing all of our collective ideas to take forward. So welcome back, everyone. We're moving now into the final section of today's consultation, where we'll consolidate all these knowledge gaps that we've discussed and identified. So our task now as a plenary group is to draw out some of the similarities identified in terms of key barriers and knowledge gaps that were discussed in the different groups. And what we want to do is group these Post-it notes that have been filled out with similar ideas under a similar icon on your Miro board, and you should all be able to see that now. So before we do that, why don't doesn't everybody just take a few minutes to read through and get familiar with what's been entered on those sticky notes so that we can help identify some common categories? Okay, I think everyone's probably had chance to skim through. Please keep doing if you haven't had a chance to look through all of those. I think there certainly are some common categories that jump out. Does anyone want to volunteer to identify either what in their group or across others they see as a key kind of category of knowledge gap or barrier that should be addressed to further integrate climate change and social protection? Yeah, go ahead, Luke.
I thought, thanks, Tom. I would just sort of flag, I mean, something that was really coming up quite consistently in our group, and it did before in the earlier plenary, but just that realism, just being clear in terms of, you know, what should we expect from social protection in terms of addressing climate risks. You know, there are some aspects of social protection, you know, I mean, a core function is to help people address risks. So, you know, how can we sort of identify things that, you know, would help ensure that we're sort of allowing social protection to fulfill its core function, and what are those things perhaps that maybe go a bit beyond, you know, what we should expect from social protection. So just that seemed to be a very sort of common theme, I think, that realism and, you know, quick wins as well, that sort of thing, because otherwise it's potentially a very big you know, topic of discussion, I think.
Very definitely. Thank you. I know that came up in art as well. Thanks for pointing that out. Other very important themes that you see bubbling up across the breakout rooms. I know in our group, and based on my scan, financing is a huge one. It's so different, as Lara pointed out in our group, between, say, established social protection schemes and those that are just more nascent. But the financing, particularly sustainable financing of these, is a key issue.
Well, and Tom, I think there were two issues under financing. One is, you know, financing for the core social protection systems to address comprehensiveness, adequacy, coverage. But the other is to address, you know, how can social protection programs, social protection dollars count towards climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and how can climate finance be used to strengthen social protection. So some issues around sort of pots of money and commingling pots of money and reporting sources across those. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Okay, who else wants to volunteer? What's a kind of critical issue that you discussed in your group? And
Tom, if I may, it's Angelica. The other point that I see that is that it came in different groups as well is the issue of data and information, and it's related on the one hand to have a more robust evidence based on the linkages between SP and climate change, but also on the need to strengthen the systematic data collection and the information systems that link social protection and adaptation across levels. So, you know, with the governments, with the actions that are being undertaken in the ground at the community level and so on and so forth. So a big area around information, data, and knowledge sharing. Thank you.
thank you, Angelica. Yeah, I know that was discussed, different issues related to evidence generation around this, including, you know, how can we be a bit more consistent in measuring, you know, through similar instruments and, you know, outcomes related to climate change adaptation, to the more absorptive and adaptive elements of social protection, and specifically resilience outcomes. I know that some programs are trying to do this, but in our group, it was noted that everyone's at a little bit different stage of that evidence generation as it relates to social protection, climate change adaptation, and resilience.
And also, just to build a little bit on data, using risk-informed data, but challenges with, the quality and availability of that data, using early warning system data, risk-informed financing. I mean, there's a lot around data and financial data. So just to layer that onto those stickies. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Others? No, I think
To quickly
just
interject,
maybe go ahead.
are there any post-its in the gray area on the left-hand side that have similar themes to those that we've already grouped under the sun, the wheat, and the corn icons? We're trying to see where the clusters of ideas are. And we want to be able to move, our goal as a group right now is to move the post-its from the gray area into different categories, different icons. So if there's anything you see that's standing out to you that should be grouped under the sun, the wheat, or the corn, or could be another pairing, another category, please feel free to share that with us. Angelica?
Camille, there's an issue that was also mentioned in our group, which relates to the temporal scale at which we are approaching the linkages between SP and climate change. And there's a couple of post-its there that highlight the fact that we're focusing on shocks, but we also need to look at the medium and the long-term scale. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I was just going to add in if possible. Sorry, Luke, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm being patient with my hand because I know I already spoke.
No, I was just going to add that I think the fact that the point that social protection cannot solve all the climate issues, I think it goes into realism and expectations. So if that blue one, yeah, thank you very much.
And I would just say maybe this checking that the current social protection design isn't perpetuating climate risk. We had a very interesting example of that, programs that can almost encourage people to stay in a certain area to continue receiving benefits. I would say that's almost linked to the measurement and data. I mean, I would say broadly in terms of evidence, looking outside the box rather than just impact evaluations, looking at potential adverse impacts of the programs like that. Yeah, and I'll come back in a minute with another sort of bucket that's maybe a different category, which it might not be there at the moment, but came up.
Stefan?
Great, thank you, Luke. Stefan, I see you have your hand up also. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point on the matter of realism. I think one buzzword that I don't see yet is the word fragility. Yeah, I mean, as I think most of us know, the issues of climate, fragility, and conflict, and poverty, they tend to be strongly correlated, and that these are precisely the contexts where it's really hard to establish social protection. So I think that we also need to feature that somehow into our equations when it comes to realism and what it implies to all the other aspects, financing, etc.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lara.
Yeah, I just was going to say, moving some more of those things, yes, under realism. But I think a missing bucket maybe so far is this sort of issue of program design, which had the program design, targeting, the layering, those are all sort of design issues. And something else was missing over realism, but the sticky said move, so I'll stop. Thank you.
No, that's helpful. I think we are all mindful of that other category of issues related to design. I'm mindful of time, but before we jump to the next step, Luke, did you have another point that you wanted to add related to design or something else?
I mean, I think it applies to different categories actually, and it's the issue of coordinating and having sort of cross-sector discussions. So particularly with climate scientists, the climate community, how we can convene those discussions. I think that would apply have implications for financing, for example, but it would also apply to the design issues, sort of just bringing people together from, the different communities and how we can do that. I think it would have implications for all these different categories here. So it might be a cross-cutting one, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's try this in terms of this next step. Now that we've kind of identified some of these common categories, can we go the next step and just name broadly what these categories might be? For this first, in terms of setting realistic expectations, what would we looking at the sticky notes below, what would be a good kind of label for this category?
Can I would suggest you move the inflation of environment and climate. I wouldn't quite phrase it that way exactly for this purpose, but essentially adaptation has been seen as an environment issue, and for amongst a lot of our folks sort of outside of that aren't working directly in climate related programming. So I think it probably goes a bit with that cross-cutting example. Like we just need to kind of broaden the discussion. And the conflation is really environment and adaptation, I think, not environment and climate writ large, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Tom, I think we have 3 Post-its that are still in the gray area.
Mm-hmm.
What do folks think about how we should place them under the current clusters? So we've got how to best leverage the growing attention to climate change for strengthening SP. Social protections should be a systems level transformative change. And how do we convene key actors?
Just to address the post-it on social protection should be systems level change. The point related to that was also talking about equity. So the policies and kind of macro level, approaches may do things at scale. It doesn't still take into account equity. So this links probably to program design, but I don't know, maybe there's some other linkages as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ruby. And good point, Camille. I don't know, maybe it will be easier to slot those remaining stickies if we can just quickly identify some categories. So I think, going back to the first one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's where I think it should go.
Great.
Cross-cutting.
Cross-cutting. We have one more outstanding post-it. Maybe we just move that very quickly. Leveraging the growing attention.
Maybe on that one, I think we have under the category regarding evidence, we kind of have 2 separate aspects, right? I think one is basically evidence generation and evidence-based decisions overall. And the other one is the specific question around the use of data in or for program design. So kind of the whole design aspect under the 5th category here. And I think if we divvy it up and one is more on knowledge generation, overall evidence generation and advocacy, I think then we could include the orange one there as well. And maybe put some of the data related questions. I mean, it's just one design aspect, right? Even though it goes across different institutions, different sectors. If we look at, how data and information is shared between social protection actors, DRM, climate related ones. So I do think that might be an easy way to go about it. Sorry, and one more thing then also on the design. I mean, one thing was within programs or at program level to actually look at how to combine or layer different mechanisms. But I think then also the system level aspect, so how to actually bring together different sectors in the planning and design process already, looking at policies, programs, and delivery mechanisms. I think that would be kind of a broader category.
Christina, you mentioned that this post-it around leveraging the growing attention could fall alongside the evidence, right? And call that evidence and advocacy. Okay, all right. So I see, Tom, you've started to name them.
Just in the interest of time.
Yes.
Because I'm watching time, and these are categories that we want to take the next step to actually vote on your prioritization. And again, you know, sorry to skip right ahead, Camille, but I think we need to get this group's input on where these priorities are. So now that we've grouped these ideas together, we want to see what I think are the most pressing knowledge gaps to address. And so we're going to ask you to give a vote on these categories. I didn't finish naming that one, Emily, that you're in. Yeah, cross-cutting. Thank you. So I think all of them have at least prospective labels right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop sharing our screen now and give you a link to the Miro board in the chat box. And when we do, please click the link to join the board, and we'll guide you the next step. But basically, Emily's going to bring you to the frame where you'll be able to vote. Once you see join voting, please click on that. And then to vote, the plus symbol next to your top 3 priority categories under which the post-its are listed. And if you click on an icon or post-it accidentally, you can click the minus button to remove your vote. But once everyone has had a chance to vote, Emily will end and she'll show us the results. What we're doing here is just, again, based on those stickies that Emily showed that are under those major categories or labels that we named, we just want to get your personal prioritization of those categories. So amongst setting realistic expectations, financing, measurement of advocacy, shifting from short to long-term design, and the cross-cutting issues we discussed, you get to vote on the 3 that you think are most critically important. They're all obviously important, but we're asking your personal prioritization of these categories.
It looks like everyone who joined the Miro board has finished voting, so I will end the voting now.
Okay, so I see the results of the votes. I'm going to try to match the votes to those labels that we've got. So let's see, looks like measurement, evidence, and advocacy is the winner here. There's a lot of discussion on issues related to measurement, evidence, and advocacy, but that's important, obviously, to all of us. Followed closely by financing. We know that this is a really extensive topic, financing of social protection and climate change adaptation, that we purposefully, you know, kind of avoided getting into real detailed discussion of that, but it's critically important. So thanks. And then it's pretty close after that. I think, you know, varying priorities. And I think, you know, someone in our group mentioned that it's important to ask prioritization for whom and prioritization where and over what time frame, because our priorities may change at different stages. But I think for now, we're seeing that design is another key priority amongst you all. So I guess turning to our final kind of request for you, what we want to ask of you is to, now that we've prioritized financing, evidence generation and measurement, and program design, we want to ask you what type of technical support or follow-up research or specific advocacy efforts or convening efforts would be most practically useful for addressing these barriers and knowledge gaps. So think on that for a bit, and you can share your thoughts verbally or in the chat box. But please, what we're asking here is based on what we've prioritized to answer the question, okay, so what? Now that we have these priorities, whether it's the Real2 consortium, whether it's specific donors or other actors, other convening groups, what is most practically useful as a concrete follow-up step for these priorities? We've talked about, various options, and it's all up to you to know, based on your expertise, what's out there, what knowledge is out there and what is not. We've talked about, maybe we could put together some very basic operational guidance for key actors in certain conks. Maybe there's specific and detailed follow-up research that we need. Maybe we're already sitting on different groups that would be really good assets to convene this type of discussion. So again, there are a lot of options. Please just weigh in on what you think would be, again, most practically useful given where we are.
I must wonder, one of the things that came up in our group was establishing a common language, and it takes me back like 20 years of thinking about how to have economists speak to anthropologists. But we wear different hats, so I think developing a common language of how these initiatives can support one another, right? How does using a national social protection system benefit climate adaptation, benefit mitigation, and vice versa? But I think there's some linguistical and conceptual wording that needs to be framed to have better harmony.
Thank you, Lara. That's a really good point. Again, I encourage others to weigh in on this at this point via chat if you can. Yeah, Montero, I see you've raised your hand.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing us together. I think in the end, we want to know, what is it going to take to really contribute to these three categories in practice on the ground. So maybe one of the early steps we can take is to identify the top research and learning questions under these categories that feed directly into the what will it take question. That can then translate into the operations and the kind of guidance that you just mentioned. That is possible now for countries in hand to begin to act. I don't think there's an urgency to the climate problem. I think that's been missing in a lot of conversations. So in that interest, and in addressing the what will it take with that sense of urgency in identifying the priority research and learning questions, that would be, I think, really helpful. Over. Thanks.
Super, thank you. And I see others are still adding into that comment session. Please keep doing that if you have thoughts, but seeing that we're almost out of time, I'm going to turn it back to you, Lara, to close this up.
Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for your time this morning, for your energy, for your ideas, for expanding your brain into different places that it goes on a normal basis and connecting these two different agendas. I just want to say a couple things here, which is that there are a number of platforms that exist already to help continue this dialogue. I think Marie Christina put one in the chat, but there is a social protection and climate change working group that is under the USP 2030. I think Emily just put the link. That's one place to sign up to continue these conversations. There's also socialprotection.org. I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. Valentina's been sharing resources from there, as well as the new iteration of SPACE, which is, I guess, now STAR. That's through FCDO, I think BMC and the Australians, providing actual technical support on the ground to governments, to implementing partners to anyone that asks in terms of specific projects. So thinking about if there's a pilot country or a case study, that is a mechanism to get that funded. And just also to remind you guys, this is one of 3 consultations. The next one is going to be around social protection and inclusion. So if you are interested in continuing this dialogue with us, please, you can either put it in the chat or follow up by email and just let us know that you'll be interested. And lastly, I will just say there's a quick survey to help inform how you felt this went, to help inform our next 2 consultations. If you like the format, if you didn't like the format, you have suggestions, we would love to know that. And thank you so much for lending your time and expertise and energy to our discussion today. So thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Thank you.